Welcome to Storytime with Mr. Warner. Chapter 3. I Don't Have It. I wish they'd get on with it. We've been standing here for ages, Frankie moaned. She lifted her weight from her right left to her left foot. Lydia nodded but said nothing. You're very quiet, Frankie whispered. Am I? Lydia forced a smile. The assembly hall was now completely different from the way it had been the previous afternoon. It was filled to overflowing with the rest of the school, all whispering and coughing, and Lydia looked around. There, 2 rows in front of her, was Anne. A slight smile played over Anne's face as Lydia watched. Anne turned to look at the cup cabinet, then back at Lydia. Lydia turned her head to look at the cabinet, but there were too many heads in the way for her to see more than the top left-hand corner of it. Attention, everyone, pay attention, Mr. Simmers, the headmaster, called out from up the stage. Mr. Simmers was a stout man who obviously enjoyed his food. He wore round spectacles which were too small for his face and made him look like a wise owl. Lydia liked him though. On her first day at Cullivel, she had gone out of her way to be friendly, and he did too. He did rather talk as if he just swallowed the dictionary, but at least he always seemed to have a smile on his face. Except for now. I have something very serious to report, Mr. Simmers said. He peered over the top of his glasses, his beady gaze darting across the assembly hall, lighting on one person after another. The Cullivel Best All-Rounder Sports Cup has been stolen. An audible gasp filled the hall. Lydia's mouth dropped open. She looked across at Anne, but Anne was looking straight up at the stage. Who'd fleeced that dusty old piece of tin foil? Frankie scoffed. Lydia had to fight to breathe normally. All at once she was burning up. Now it was the only cup and no other which was taken. I'm inclined to believe that it was the work of someone from this school, rather than a professional thief. But I want it back. Mr. Simmers' cheeks puffed out as he spoke. The perpetrator of this perfidious act owns up to his or her transgression immediately after assembly. Then they will not be dealt with too severely. If, however, they do not own up and I find out who it is... Mr. Simmers left the unfinished sentence dangling ominously in the air. Not a sound could be heard. Not a murmur, not a whisper. Without warning, one of the assembly hall doors was flung open. Everyone jumped. Lydia, along with everyone else, turned to see what was happening. Mrs. Irving, the history teacher, entered the hall and took a quick look around before almost running up the stage steps. Lydia's stomach churned. She chewed nervously on her bottom lip as she watched Mrs. Irving whisper in Mr. Simmers' ear. Mr. Simmers scanned the hall as if he had suddenly developed an X-ray vision. Trembling, Lydia glanced across to the cup cabinet again before returning her gaze to the stage. Mrs. Irving was off the stage now and heading for the door. Could Julie Morgan repeat? Julie Morgan of Class 4B, please report to the school secretary immediately after assembly. Thank you. The school's secretary voice rang out over the school's public announcement system, making Lydia jump. Frankie, Lydia began. Assembly dismissed. Mr. Simmers' icy voice effectively halted Lydia's words. Frankie, I need to talk to you, Lydia whispered. She turned with the rest of her row, and they all stood waiting for their turn to troop out of the hall. What about? Frankie asked, turning her head to face Lydia. Would Lydia Henson please stay behind? It was an order, not a request. The headmaster's words stopped all whispers in the hall. Lydia was suddenly drowning under the weight of the speculative stares of those around her. She felt totally sick. She looked around dismayed, then across the hall to where Mr. Simmers stood. Why had he asked her to stay behind? What was going on? Lydia tried to catch Anne's eye, but Anne looked straight ahead as she waited for her row to be allowed to leave the hall. I'll see you later, Frankie frowned, puzzled. Lydia waited for the rest of the school to amble out. She kept her head bent, unable to meet the curious glances directed at her. And then she moved slowly down to the front of the hall. Mr. Simmers stood on the stage, towering over her like a New York skyscraper next to a beetle. He glowered at Lydia until his heavy, bushy eyebrows met over his nose. His lips pursed in an intense frown. He walked over to the side of the stage and marched down the steps. "Do you have something you wish to tell me, Lydia?" he asked. Lydia's "no, sir" was stuck somewhere between her tongue and the roof of her mouth, and she shook her head slowly. "Follow me," Mr. Simmers commanded. The headmaster strode out of the hall, not bothering to look at Lydia. Lydia followed him. She could do nothing else. Why had he picked her out? If only Lydia could have spoken to Anne, just for a minute. She longed to know what was going on. But who could she ask? Certainly not Mr. Simmers. He looked as if his head was about to explode. Maybe he knew about her being in the hall late the previous afternoon after school. Maybe old Baldy had told him, and Mr. Simmers just wanted to talk to her about who else she might have seen around at that time. To Lydia's surprise, Mr. Simmers didn't lead the way to his office, but instead turned right. Lydia wondered where they were going. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The girls' cloakroom. Lydia had to trot up to keep up with Mr. Simmers' long stride, and once inside they looked down the second aisle to the left of the cloakroom doors and saw Lydia and Mrs. Irvine and Mr. Balding, the caretaker. They were all standing ahead. The cloakroom was almost steaming with warm, damp coats, and the hooks, they were stood up and they were up and down the aisles. At last Mr. Simmers came to an abrupt halt. The headmaster and Mr. Balding looked at each other. Mr. Balding nodded almost imperceptibly. "Lydia Hanson, is this your locker?" Mr. Simmers pointed to the locker in front of him, but his eyes never left Lydia's face. Lydia tried to speak, but the words got lost in her throat. She swallowed and tried again. "Yes, sir." The words came out of the frightened squeal. "Open it," Mr. Simmers ordered. Lydia looked at all three of the grown-ups before looking at her locker. They all looked poised, as if one false move on her part and they would pounce, tearing her to pieces. Lydia's heart pummeled in her ribs. What was wrong? What was going on? Wiping her clammy hands on her skirt, she walked forward. She reached out to the combination lock on her locker door before realising that the locker door was shut, but not locked. "It's open," she said, surprised. "Mr. Balding has been opening all the lockers in here and the boys' cloakroom on my instructions," said Mr. Simmers. "I have reason to believe that the sports cup would still be on the school premises." Lydia stared from her locker to Mr. Simmers' stony face and back again. Her eyes widened to their absolute limit. "I don't